All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. My name is Jamil Jaffer, and I'm the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute here at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. We're thrilled to have Secretary Mike Pompeo here with us today. As you all know, Secretary Pompeo was sworn in 2018 as the 70th Secretary of State. Prior to that, he served as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency from January 2017 to April 2018. Prior to joining the Trump administration, Secretary Pompeo served 4 terms as a member of Congress from Kansas' 4th Congressional District. He served on the House Intelligence Committee, where I was a staff member for Chairman Mike Rogers, as well as on the Energy and Commerce Committee, the House Select Benghazi Committee. Prior to his time in Congress, some of you may not know, but Secretary Pompeo founded an aerospace company, Thayer Aerospace, where he served as a CEO for over a decade. He also became the president of Century International, an oil field manufacturing company, and the like. One thing that a lot of people don't know about Secretary Pompeo is that he graduated first in his class at West Point, 1986, served as a cavalry officer, patrolling the Iron Curtain before the fall of the Berlin Wall. After serving on active duty, Secretary Pompeo wasn't done. He went to Harvard Law School, served as the editor of the Harvard Law Review, and then, of course, he went on to amazing things. Secretary, wonderful to have you here. Thanks for being with us today.
Jamil, it's great to be with you. Your former boss, Mike Rogers, I credit or blame, as the moment may be, for launching me. He was instrumental in me getting to serve on the House Intelligence Committee, and I think that opened up an awful lot of opportunities for me.
He really is a terrific person and a great man, and we're thrilled to have you here, though. Secretary, I want to jump right in if it's all right by you. And for folks in the audience, by the way, we're going to have Secretary Pompeo stick around with us. We're going to ask some questions. We're going to take questions from the audience probably about 30, 40 minutes in. But I'm going to jump in with some questions of my own first to start. So, Secretary, we saw a disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of last year. People falling off of planes as we left the country trying to get out with us. A number of our allies left behind, American citizens, American green card holders left behind in that country. The Biden administration pointed back at the Trump administration and said, well, it wasn't really our fault. It began under Trump. It began with the withdrawal there. Talk to us about the decision to withdraw and ultimately how you would have handled withdrawal had you still been in office on the day that withdrawal actually happened.
Well, Jamil, there's no doubt what President Trump wanted to do. He tweeted about it dozens of times. Right, he wanted every one of our young men and women back home. We thought 20-something years was enough, and so that was the mission set. It was the mission set during the campaign. It was my mission set when I became CIA director. There was a huge CIA operation inside of Afghanistan too. So I was at the center of this for all 4 years. And what we had charted was a path that said, look, we want to get everybody out. We want to do it as quickly as we can. It's a promise you made to the American people, but we have to meet the right set of conditions to do so. And so that was the charge. The charge was to go meet those conditions. We never got all the way there. We got from, about 15,000 or so American uniformed military personnel. There was a contingent of NATO forces about half that same size. And we began to draw down together as we got closer, as we could see that we could still maintain deterrence and stability, albeit Afghan stability. So use that word lightly, but deterrence and stability, we could pull out. We got down to about 2,500 by January of 2021, and that was as far as we were able to get along the trajectory. I can't tell you how many times President said, Mike, you got to go faster. Became Secretary of State. He said, Mike, I want you to talk to the Taliban, see if we can't reduce risk even further. Look, we knew this was a 10-year negotiation, right? Think of the FARC, think of South Africa. These are long negotiations to get to the outcome. We knew that, but we also thought that engaging with the Taliban would reduce our risk that we would have a bad day. We never got to the moment where we could look at the president and say, we can meet all of the conditions. They were right to continue to reduce risk. We'd be attacked from that place, to get every American out, to get all the folks who'd supported us, or at least nearly all the folks who'd supported us out, and to get our equipment home too. We never got there. And so we left an unfinished mission. President Biden came in and said, nope, we're going to set a date certain. I can promise you this. The military told him, don't do that. I know that not because I was in the room, because I know what General Scotty Miller, a long time, decades-long friend of mine, told me. I know what General Milley told the president. Don't do it. You got to get the conditions right. And don't set an arbitrary date. So we never did. In spite of everybody saying President Trump was reckless and crazy, it turned out that President Biden was reckless and dangerous. Whether he was crazy or not, anybody can decide. But he made a decision that cost an American an awful lot, 13 American lives. We disgraced the country by leaving Americans behind. I can't tell you what our timeline would have been to ultimately achieve the president's mission, but I am very confident that President Trump would have allowed us the space and the opportunity to set the conditions so that we could ultimately achieve the end goal, which I share, which was to get our young men and women home.
So, Secretary, how do we take the time to get it right and to get folks out? What have we been able to bring, not just all the Americans out, but we've been able to bring our Afghan allies out? Many of them remain stranded there. People that are men and women in uniform, like you served, people they made promises to about what they would do for them if they served alongside us at great risk to themselves, their families. When we've been able to get all of them out, and in either event, having now left those folks behind, what does that say for our alliances around the globe? And what does it tell people who might want to work with the U.S. going forward? As you know, as a CIA director, you count on the willingness of assets and other folks to work with the United States based on representations that we make. What does it do for our ability to recruit assets and the like?
Yeah, I think it makes it harder. The question of what could we have ever done it's unanswerable. I don't know. The two conditions that were difficult, right, was to continue to maintain a posture that reduced risk of a terror attack from that place. That's a hard task without American forces on the ground. But we had a theory of the case. I won't say more, but we had a theory on how we could actually deliver that. And we were working to try and identify how many we really need to get out, what the right tool, what the right sequencing on that was. I get asked all the time, could you have done it? I wish I'd have had another 1,000 days to take a run at it, because I believe that I could, but I certainly I can't prove that out. Your greater point, and maybe more important point, is that no, there's no doubt. Our friends now wonder, will we do what we did again? Will we leave them behind again? If you're looking at this ex ante, your calculus changes. You may still decide to work with the Americans because we're pretty damn good partners. And so I don't think this is the end of that. I think there'll still be a lot of folks who say, no, I want to join Team America. But there's no doubt they will be looking for the assurances that they had received here to have a better guarantee than the one we actually provided them in the end in Afghanistan.
One of the things, Secretary, that we've seen in the aftermath of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan has been the role that China's played there. They have now announced a $1 trillion economic partnership. Should we be concerned about the role that China might play in the region, Central Asia, the like, the role they're playing and sort of the pressure they're putting on India? What should we be thinking about China's role in the region? And then, we might expand out from that globally as we think about this larger looming threat on the horizon that China poses.
Well, I'm sure we'll spend a fair amount of time talking about the larger threat from the Chinese Communist Party. Secretary Blinken made some remarks this morning that in my judgment won't prove helpful in that mission set. As for their work in Central Asia, it's something they've been after for a long time. The $1 trillion story in Afghanistan is a joke. Not sure what you do with $1 trillion in a place like Afghanistan. But $50 or $100 or a couple $1 million is meaningful money. So $1 billion or several billion, let alone $1 trillion, they can have an awful lot of influence. They'll find it difficult too. This is not a straight line place. Make no mistake about it. The other countries, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, all the neighbors, Iran, Pakistan, the Indians have deep interest there too. They will make life difficult as China decides to move in. I can assure you the Chinese will find, just as the Russians did, and frankly, just as we did, this is a pretty harsh place with lots of cross-cutting interests. And if you think for a moment you're going to stamp out corruption, or you're going to somehow find the magic keys to get these tribes to actually work alongside of each other, Godspeed, my friend.
Yeah. It's a good point. I actually misspoke. I was thinking about the $1 trillion of potential untapped mineral reserves that are there present in Afghanistan. You're right to make that point. So as we think about, China in the region, China globally, we know about what's happened in Ukraine with Russia, and we'll come back to that. But I want to talk for a second about China and Taiwan, right? There's been a lot of talk about the way that China has been very aggressive towards Taiwan. We've seen the air incursions, we've seen the like. And there's a concern that in the aftermath of our withdrawal from Afghanistan, given our decision to take troops off the table in Ukraine, which we'll come back to, that China might be looking at Taiwan and saying, is the U.S. really going to defend it? We had the president, of course, say that we're prepared to defend military. The White House, within minutes, walked it back. What, in your mind, what is the president or the administration's current position on Taiwan, and what should it be if there were a next Republican administration, whether it's a Pompeo or a Trump administration, or something different?
Sure. I couldn't tell you what the Biden administration's policy is, and I'm not sure they could either. That's really dangerous, Because if I don't know, or if they're not clear, that is, if there are fights inside the administration about what it should be, and we had our debates too. But if the president hasn't driven home, here's how we're going to approach this, our adversaries will see this, not just the Chinese, but others and our friends, those who we're going to ask to help us in ensuring that Taiwan has its sovereignty maintained. Think Japan, think South Korea, think Australia, think of all the other potential partners in the region. They're going to be confused too, and their willingness to engage with us on this central mission of supporting Taiwan and its independence from China will be much, much, much more difficult, and we will end up having to go it alone. That's a bad set of policies. For me, my view of Taiwan is that this is the moment to build them up, not after they've already taken the island, not after they've already got a foothold on a small island, not after they've already killed tens of thousands of people. That's what we did in Ukraine, right? We said a minor incursion is okay. And then once they'd killed several thousand Ukrainians and had invaded on 4 axes, we said, you know what? We think we're going to provide them with some weapons. Today is the day. We began this. We provided F-16s, air defense systems, a lot of intelligence sharing during my time as CIA director. We were serious about helping Taiwan be capable of changing the cost calculus for Xi Jinping. I pray that we're continuing that process. I hope some of it's being done in the quiet and the dark. That's perfectly fine by me. But the policy should be to build out a set of alliances and a set of tools for the Taiwanese such that the Chinese Communist Party concludes, not on this watch.
Yeah. Well, we talk a lot about deterrence and the deterrent effect of providing weapons and providing assistance up front. One of the things that happened in Russia and the Ukraine conflict is that the Trump administration was the first administration to actually provide weaponry to Ukraine to defend itself. That obviously has been doubled down upon now by the Biden administration. It ultimately that early provision though of weaponry, and then the Biden decision not to provide additional weaponry or the substantial amount they provided to date, doesn't seem to deter the Russians from going in. Can the provision of weaponry alone deter without a commitment to defend? And if it might work in Taiwan, why didn't it work in Ukraine? Well,
it's a fair question. I get asked the same kind of question, or the counterfactual. It seems a bit unfair, but they never asked John Kerry these kinds of questions. But I get asked all the time, hey, Mike, would Putin have done this if you were still there, if President Trump was still there? Again, I suppose I could just say no and move on. But the reality is, I always try to stick to the facts. Here's the facts. What changed? Vladimir Putin didn't change. His desire for greater Russia is pretty consistent over 2 decades now. What changed was American leadership and Vladimir Putin's perception of American leadership. They take Crimea under President Obama. We show up. No more Ukrainian land invasions. They still fought in the Donbass. They fired artillery across the line of control. They didn't go do what he's done. And then within, just a handful of months of our departure, 13 months from the time we left office, Vladimir Putin decides he's got the space to quote Southwest Airlines, to move about the cabin freely. That's the central thesis of deterrence. And it's not just the tools, Jamil, you've got it right. There's no number of weapons that alone are going to deter someone from Vladimir Putin. It has to be the collective will and the collective capacity to say, here's the red line, here's the things I'm prepared to do. And the moment they step across it, you have to go crush them. And I don't think that Vladimir Putin believed for a second that Biden was prepared to do that or lead the Europeans in that effort. And that's unfortunate. That's cost an awful lot of Ukrainian lives. And I'm happy, I'm fully supportive of what the Biden administration is doing today to provide them with weapons. I wish they give them long-range defensive weapon systems as well. If they did that, I think you'd decrease the risk to the Ukrainian people who have fought so valiantly, and you would strengthen the capacity for Europe to do what it needs to do so that we can, in fact, turn our attention to the battle of our time, the battle against the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, so now as we look at the way this has played out in Ukraine and in Russia, the same thing might be said about Taiwan, the Chinese have gotten more aggressive under the Biden administration. They've started to posture more. And the question becomes, what lesson could the Biden administration or a future Republican administration learn from Ukraine when it comes to Taiwan? Can we convince the Chinese that the cost will be so high? Can we put enough weaponry in, provide enough intelligence, provide enough F-16s, that the cost will be so high it's not worth doing? And if we can or cannot, either way, if they do cross the line, what should the American response be?
Yeah, so there aren't enough weapons. So the tools have to be much more broad than that. I actually think this is one of the lessons that Xi Jinping may draw too, and it's unfortunate. Today, the ruble is worth more than it was when the invasion began. And if we're not prepared to sanction the Russian economy at a sufficient level to impact their currency, goodness gracious, Xi Jinping knows we're not about to do that to an economy which is so deeply connected to the American economy during the Biden administration. So I think he not only believes that we won't use our economic might against him, but he's probably pretty confident that in spite of what President Biden said, we're not likely to put our forces there. Our policy should be very straightforward. This isn't difficult. We should rally the Pacific nations to make clear that the costs, and we don't have to articulate these publicly, but that the cost to Xi Jinping and his regime will be staggering, and that it's not worth the candle for him. It's not about landing the 82nd Airborne in Shanghai. It's not about a Marine amphibious force hitting the shores of Eastern China. It's about making clear that the economy, the Chinese are far more dependent on us than we are on them. If they can't get Saudi or American or Emirati or Qatari fossil fuels, that economy is dead in the stinking water. We should make clear to them that we are prepared to exercise every American power to help the Taiwanese defend themselves. They may still make the decision to invade. It's entirely possible. But I actually think Xi Jinping is smart enough to say, you know, I'm not going to go about it that way. Frankly, I'm at odds with many of my Republican colleagues. I think the risk to Taiwan is far less a military invasion than it is something that looks like Hong Kong, or something that looks like Mongolia or Tibet or Western China. It is a political takeover through all of the tools that the Chinese Communist Party has at hand, including its cyber capabilities and its information warfare capabilities. I think already the tools that have been provided to Taiwan would make a military invasion deeply costly for the Chinese Communist Party. They might ultimately succeed, but I think Xi believes that he has another avenue to achieve it. And that's the avenue that I think is really important for the United States to join in the game and make sure that they don't use those other tools to ultimately achieve through political manipulation and subterfuge and covert action to gain control of Taiwan through non-military means. I worry about that at least as much as I do as an amphibious assault on the island of Formosa itself on Taiwan.
And I do want to talk about some of these other tools that they have and how they use them in Hong Kong and how they use them with the Uyghurs and how they might utilize them and how they've used them overtly and covertly to influence politics here in the United States. But I want to one last time just sort of try to drill down on the military question, and then I'll let it go. I will let it go. So if the Chinese come across the Taiwan Strait and land in Taipei, should the U.S. have committed ahead of time to a military defense of Taiwan? And if not, does that increase the risk that the Chinese may miscalculate along the lines you suggest and actually come across the Taiwan Strait? Would it reduce risk if the U.S. were to clearly commit that we would use military force if they invaded?
Yeah,
with our allies.
You can ask me a couple thousand times. I'm going to give the same answer that I have given for the last couple of months. Taiwan is an independent sovereign nation. The United States ought to recognize that sovereignty. We ought to cut the tie. We ought to make very clear that there are in fact two Chinas. Taiwan is one of them. Call it what you will. We should get rid of this idea somehow that we're going to try and sit in this never land. The mushy middle is a dangerous place. If Ukraine proves one thing, the mushy middle is a very dangerous place, and we ought to help the Taiwanese people get out of that mushy middle. I said this when I went to Taipei. Gosh, it's been 3 months now. I said this when I went to Taipei. I said that the United States should recognize the independent sovereignty of Taiwan, and that would be an important statement for the world to make. I hope other nations would join us when we did that as well.
Absolutely. And for the audience, we are going to come to your questions here in about 15 minutes or so. So please get those into the Q&A box, and we'll come around to those here shortly. So, Secretary, you mentioned cyber and the Chinese capabilities in cyber. We've been talking a lot as a nation about the threat that's posed by nation states in the cyber domain, organized criminal gangs. We've seen the spread of ransomware across the nation. As Secretary of State, you approved the creation of a new bureau, the Bureau of Cyberspace Security and Emerging Technologies. You led the change at CIA from to change the Information Operations Center to this new digital scenario. Talk to us about how we ought to be thinking about both offensive cyber as a nation and the defensive side of it. How good are we at offensive? How should we be utilizing it? And then what should we be worried about on the defensive side?
Jamil, I'll go back to a baseline idea that caused me to do each of those things, which was, if you looked at the places where America has the capacity to just dominate our adversaries, it's America's economy and our technological capabilities. It is no surprise that if you look at the businesses that have dominated American technology for the last, or global technology for the last 25 years, they have almost all been American companies. I wanted to use that American knowledge, technology, know-how, and capability. I wanted to bring it inside the United States government to America's national security advantage. And so lots of work streams that flow down from that. They culminate in our capacity to defend our own systems. Defense is always really, really hard to play. We're good at it. Our core infrastructure is pretty good at it, but they're all penetrable. At the end of the day, a determined adversary can play offense a lot cheaper than you can play defense. And so ideas of redundancy and things that are off of the system, backup capabilities that you can immediately transport into, those are the ways you provide continuity for the important systems, our financial system, our electrical grid, all the core things that you just can't have down for more than just a little bit, and keep your economy thriving and your people healthy and safe. So defense is hard to play. We should keep working at it. We should make them pay every time they try to breach one of our defenses. And then we still haven't, and we didn't get this right either, we still haven't developed a offensive cyber doctrine that matches what we did in, say, strategic arms, where we had something that was called mutual assured destruction. We haven't mastered that. They're different spaces. One's very physical, the less, while kinetic is different, but we still need to work to make sure that we have them. I've heard all the different narratives. There are smarter people than me working on this, but it is really, really important that we begin to think about how to use these tools in a way that holds the sort of Damocles over the cyber sort of Damocles over the heads of our adversaries, so they know that it sits there, and they know that we can use it, and they know that we can use it in a way that won't be attributable. And if you can accomplish that, you can deter lots of bad behavior, not from the little guys, not from the ransomware folks who are trying to make $500,000 or $1 million. Those are going to be nuisances. More than that from time to time. If you're a hospital, it's not a nuisance, it's a real problem. But if you're talking about big strategic issues, we need to make sure that we have the capabilities right. And I will say this, we're pretty damn good.
Yeah. So on the question of cyber offense, there were a lot of changes the Trump administration made to our cyber doctrine, creating space for our military agencies, our intelligence agencies to take more action in that domain. There does appear to be a concern. There does appear to be an effort afoot now in the Biden administration to go back to the more interagency bureaucratic processes that took place during the Obama administration. Talk to us about what that means in terms of our ability to carry out these operations. As you point out, we are at the top of the game. We have these capabilities. At the same time, if we have this paralysis of analysis, right, where we sit there and we worry about the parade of horribles on both sides, what might happen to us if we go after them, we tend to have our lunch eaten, right? And so how can we achieve the goals we want in the cyber domain without exposing ourselves, to potential threats, given our reliance in this country on network devices and the like?
It's a continuum, and we dialed it much closer to a unitary chain of command with real decision-making authority that could be delivered in a timely fashion. We ran into early. We were saddled with and I have to be a little careful. We were saddled with a set of processes that was infinitely difficult to actually respond. There were too many cooks, too many people who could pull the cord on and shut the darn thing down. If everybody can say no, you're good, and it's 100 people, you're gonna end up with no. We modified the way we thought about it. We still, in my judgment, had plenty of process there. We gave the senior leaders at DoD and some of the other intelligence organizations a little bit more rope to work with, still in a way that ultimately the president maintained the authorities that only the president should have the authority to use. But in a lot of places, we were able to delegate that capacity to a place where there were single point decision makers who would have to own it and would have to make that decision, and who would have, in advance of making that decision, have had all the inputs from all the various stakeholders who had competing interests at play. In the end, you have to give someone the responsibility and let them pull the trigger. And
Yeah.
we were prepared to do that. We were pretty far down one route. Sounds like the Biden team is headed back into total hibernation mode. I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah. One of the other domains where we've seen a lot of action or potential developing action is the space domain. We've seen the Biden administration talk a lot more forthrightly, as the Trump administration did, about Russian and Chinese capabilities, in particular, potential offensive capabilities, activities they're undertaking with various platforms in the space domain. How concerned should we be, given our reliance on satellite technology for GPS, for intelligence collection, and for communications? How concerned should we be that the Russians or the Chinese might take action against our satellite infrastructure? And what, if anything, can we do about that?
I have to be very careful here. So it's another domain for warfare. It's a little bit different in some ways, that not every nation can participate in this form of conflict. I'm going to be a little bit circumspect here, but suffice it to say, the Chinese capability to have hypersonic glide vehicles that can sit in orbit and then on command begin to strike inside of our capacity to defend against it is something that we have to take seriously and begin to think strategically about how one might respond to such an attack, both in the moment as a defensive measure, but then proactively as a deterrence measure. The Biden administration's decision to stop certain testing, I think, creates risk, creates a gap. I'm worried they're going to create other gaps too. We're working hard on a ground-based missile system that would have been very important to put Chinese interests at risk. The Biden administration is talking about shutting that down as well. Secretary Esper and I were both working hard to get that not only developed, but find partners and allies who would permit us to field it in their space. Those are the kinds of things that often take years, and to have a 4-year gap where these programs are shut down because there's either no guidance or guidance directing that it be shut down will be something that our adversaries can see. And they will, when they see that gap, they'll start to move their resources in and perhaps foreclose our capabilities in ways that we will regret 5 or 10 or 15 years from now.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. Let's return to the current conflict in Ukraine and sort of the implications for our alliances, and then we'll turn to the audience for questions. So, we've seen this play out now for a few months in Ukraine. We've seen the Russians come across the border. We've seen wanton attacks on civilians, war crimes, rape, murder, and the like. And what appears to be, while the Russians appear to be having a number of setbacks, they were pushed out of Kyiv, they're facing challenges elsewhere, they are succeeding in gaining some amount of ground in the east and the like. How should we think about what comes next? What in your mind, what does the end of this conflict look like? Does it end with the Russians keeping some additional portion beyond Crimea of Ukraine? And if so, what does that say for the Ukraine's ability, or the ability of the next nation that the Russians go after, to hold their territory, maintain their sovereignty, and the like?
It's funny when I hear people talk about the end of things. I've become a bit cynical. These things don't end. Right? There's no end to Russian aggression. I suppose there's an end someday when Thomas Jefferson becomes president of Russia. But until that time, it's not even just Vladimir Putin. Oh, what happens when Vladimir Putin goes away? The next Russian asshole becomes the leader of Russia, right? We think in the West, we think about things with a terminal velocity, this will end, and then we'll all go back to where we were. Vladimir Putin's army may stop. His navy may stop sailing the Black Sea. He may stop firing missiles. It's just, it doesn't mean we've reached the terminal point, that we've reached the end. It's the West loses its mind by thinking, oh, right, Clinton talked about a peace dividend. Well, fair enough. But the bad guys around the world are just merely biding their time. And so this requires continuity. It requires consistency. It requires consistency across Democrat and Republican administrations. Right. I pray that we don't search for an end to this conflict in Europe as a gosh, we all shook hands and we met at the center of the Dnieper River and shook hands like Appomattox. This isn't the way evil plays out in the world. And so I suspect we're going to be at this slog for a while. I think Vladimir Putin will continue, but I remind everyone that even if tomorrow we wake up and Vladimir Putin announces to his own people that he's gotten victory and he's holding on to this land and it's a charade. He will be just as determined the moment he walks off stage, having given that speech, to build that greater Russia than he was the day he invaded in February. And we should be mindful. And I say this to my European friends, who I fear when this moment passes, when it's not on the, when BBC isn't covering it 20 hours a day, but 20 minutes a day, that they'll go back and say, yeah, we can sell a whole lot of cars there and we can make a whole lot of money there. And they go back to the model where they spent, pick a number, 0.2% of their GDP to defend their own nation. And no German young boy decides to join the German army. We need them to be mindful. They have a responsibility to put not only their money, but their people where their defense and security needs are. And if they think this is ended, if Europe comes to conclude, well, that was a bad day, glad we kept them out of Estonia and Lithuania for the moment, that they won't keep them out of Estonia and Lithuania for very long. Evil continues, and it means those of us who are at work trying to do good in the world are going to turn our eyes away and avert our gaze so that we can go back to our own quiet times. Risk remains.
Right. I mean, even worse, the lesson is that the administration's policy and the Europeans' approach to this whole thing was the right one. They ultimately got to a decent outcome, and so they had it right from the beginning. That would be the wrong lesson to take away from what we've seen here. So let me ask you this: what about NATO? We think about, we've seen now the conversation about Sweden and Finland joining NATO, but we've also seen pushback from Turkey. Now, the Turks obviously have unclean hands in all this. They bought the S-400s. How do we think about the stability of the NATO alliance? Does it remain strong? Is adding Sweden and Finland the right thing? And what do we do about Erdogan and Turkey and the problem they present? They were a thorn in the side for your administration. They're a thorn in the side for this administration. I mean, we have a lot of reasons to be in Turkey and to have Turkey member NATO, but they're not playing very nice with the alliance.
Yeah, it's complicated. There's no doubt about that. I mentioned my concern on NATO. My concern is that NATO is feeling its oats today. It feels like they've done good work. Fair enough. They gave the Russians one bite at the apple before they were able to stand up, and that's unfortunate. But they did defend NATO, and to date, Putin has chosen not to attack a NATO country. Good on them. I want to give General Stoltenberg and his team, Secretary General Stoltenberg and his team, full credit for having achieved that. I'm happy about that. I hope that they will continue. I would tell you too that NATO needs to take seriously the challenge from the Chinese Communist Party. It's one of the things that I pressed on. We put a big team in there in NATO to teach everybody about the risk. Make no mistake about the Chinese Communist Party's going after NATO too. They don't have too many places where they are contiguous in the sense of they butt up against each other, but there are NATO missions in lots of places in the world. The Chinese Communist Party will pursue them, and cyber is everywhere. And so we should be very clear that NATO is going to have to confront the challenge from the Chinese Communist Party, whether it thinks it was just to defeat the Soviet Union or not. Finally, Turkey. So it's a complicated problem set. We should stay engaged. By the way, we should listen to President Erdogan's concerns. Right? They do have legitimate terror concerns. There's no doubt about that. The PKK terrorists are trying to undermine Erdogan as sure as I'm sitting here. But we should also, when Erdogan makes up fantasy, when he makes claims that are unsubstantiated, we should just call him on that. We should be clear that no, those aren't valid, those aren't reasonable. When we do those things, when we provide the Turks with the support that they deserve as a NATO member, and hold Erdogan accountable when he makes claims that are not factually based, when we do that, I'm confident that ultimately Erdogan will come to understand that increasing by 2 the number of NATO nations is in his best interest, the Turkish people's best interest as well, and he ultimately won't exercise his veto. I'm sure he'll try to extract some demands. Fair enough. Maybe that's just good politics, good use of leverage in the moment. But I think we can ultimately we can find a way with Erdogan to get him to a place where he says, no, I really actually want to be a good, strong member of NATO. The S-400s burn everybody's saddle. We weren't able to push him off the square. Maybe Team Biden can do better than we did.
Yeah, well, We shall see. Well, I'll take some questions for the audience, if you don't mind. We've got about 15 questions already queued up. So I see Tevi Troy, who served in a number of Republican administrations. He wants to know about Republicans potentially taking the House in the fall. If Republicans do take the House in the fall, what should a GOP foreign policy out of the House look like? What is the right national security posture for Republicans to take? As we know, while you served in the House, there was a internal debate. We see it playing out even now with the Ukraine aid package in the Senate. What is a Republican foreign policy in the current or a new Republican-led House of Representatives look like, and what should it look like?
Yeah, well, I'm pretty optimistic too. I've been out working my tail off to help candidates all across the country, or to CAV PAC, making sure that we do in fact retake the House. I hope we retake the Senate as well. I think the American people are pretty exhausted from what they're seeing here at home today. What does a conservative foreign policy look like? I think Reagan and Trump both got it right. We were pretty restrained, frankly. So was Reagan in many ways. We were pretty restrained when it came to using our military power, but we were determined to use the soft power, the massive quantity of soft power. Think American energy delivered all across the world. Think about American technology. I was the first person to actually build out the Undersecretariat for Economic Affairs in a way that began to crush Huawei and the Chinese Communist Party, along with Secretary Ross at Commerce. We began to build out a construct to put for the first time in 25 years, this is not partisan, but the first time in 25 years, acknowledge the Chinese Communist Party is in economic war with us. Something that I think is indisputable. A good, sound conservative policy would build on those central understandings, and then it would be prepared to fight the Chinese Communist Party inside the gates as well. We shouldn't forget, this isn't just an external battle. They've stolen millions of jobs from us in the United States. They've stolen massive quantities of technology. I closed the Chinese consulate in Houston, Texas. It was one of the largest espionage operations ever conducted against our country. And we have 360,000 Chinese students studying in the United States of America today. Those are things that serious Republican leaders in the House of Representatives and the United States Senate could actually work on and deliver legislative language to push back against and protect and secure America, make us more prosperous, and impose staggering costs on Xi Jinping and his cronies. If they did those things, they might get vetoed by a Biden presidency for 2 years, but they would have laid the groundwork for what I hope will be a Republican presidency, and they will have set the course for the trajectory for American foreign policy for years to come. Last thought. You mentioned debate inside of our party. There's been a debate inside our party since the founding of our party, since the days of Lincoln. And there's been a debate in conservative circles, even before the Republican Party, about how we ought to respond. And I get some of the ideas that I heard members say about not voting for the $40 billion aid package. I'm very concerned too. I don't know how you blow through $40 billion in Ukraine in the course of a matter of weeks. That's a lot of money flooding around, and Ukraine's got an enormous amount of corruption, and I worry about that too. I hope that those who voted against it were still serious about pushing back against Putin and his authoritarian regime, but had different ideas about how to achieve that. Those are legitimate totally legitimate debates. Frankly, I would have liked to have seen them include some other tools, some long-range defensive systems for Ukraine inside of that package as well. Who knows? I might have voted against it too. I probably in the end would have voted for it. But that was an awful lot of money shoved down the throats of Congress with hours. And this is not in America's best interest either. We should be more thoughtful in the way we execute our foreign policy, in addition to being a nation that delivers good across the world and achieves peace through enormous demonstrations of American capacity for strength and goodness.
Absolutely. So Jeff Kahn, who I know you know well, it's great to see you, sir. He wanted to talk about one of the things you mentioned earlier, in response to the last question about America's greatest advantage being our economy, our leadership and innovation. We've seen China make leaps and bounds in emerging technologies. We've seen the patents on AI, blockchain, quantum. The trend lines aren't going our direction, says Jeff. And part of this, as you point out, was driven by their theft of our intellectual property. They're propping up their national champions. Do we need to shift our mindset in the United States and really focus more, maybe in some limited areas, to work more closely with U.S. industry to support our own economic and technological competitiveness? And if so, what does that look like and I'm adding this on Jeff's question, what does that look like from a conservative perspective?
Yeah, no, Jeff's got it right. It's good to hear from him. Jeff, I hope you're doing well. We took our first salvo at this with what's now become the CHIPS Act. We could see the risk from not being able to do semiconductor wafer manufacturing at the high end here inside the United States for a host of reasons. The Chinese Communist Party and other places had eaten our lunch here. Taiwan, I think TSMC, South Korea, I think Samsung were the places making it. We convinced them all using American taxpayer dollars. We convinced them all to come to the United States, and now Intel's jumped in Columbus, Ohio. Good on them. Now have a couple $100 billion in investment here in the United States to build out the next generation of semiconductor wafer manufacturing. That's a good stop. We should begin to do those same kinds of things in the 4 or 5 fields that you identified, and maybe a couple of others as well. You could say that this is industrial policy. I think of it as national security policy. We should do this through prohibitions. As opposed to trying to identify blacklisted items, we should blacklist a broad range of things and then give waivers for the handful of things we want to still continue to trade in this space with China. I think that's the only way to do it. Otherwise, you play whack-a-mole forever. And then we should create a set of incentives, not just for building out in America, but in friendly places, right? So I'm happy if those wafers are made in Japan or in Norway. Sign me up. Right. Shoot, the work we did on Huawei, I was Ericsson's best salesman for 2 years. Right? By crushing Huawei, I wasn't actually benefiting any American companies, much to my chagrin. I was benefiting European companies. We wanted secure systems coming from known allies and friends, and we should do this whether it's in quantum or blockchain technology. We should do the same kind of things. We cannot permit to have ourselves be under the screws of the Chinese Communist Party when it comes to any of these high-end technologies, not for our defensive systems, not for commercial purposes either. And that will inevitably mean turning to America's technology companies and making sure that they are in line with American expectations for how they will proceed. We can do this. I know it'll irritate some hardcore free market people inside our party, but I'm happy to have markets that are free and fair and reciprocal. That is not the space in which those technologies are being delivered today. They're being delivered against an economy that is anything but free, fair, and reciprocal with our own. And we have to change course.
So, you talk about the effort you led on Huawei, the Clean Networks Initiative and the like. And Mark Corkerall, one of our visiting fellows from outside of the United States, asks, in retrospect, looking back, what's your assessment of the effect that your diplomatic initiative had on the risk posed by Huawei equipment, not just here in the United States, but obviously around the globe with our allies and partners?
Yeah, it was real. It was significant. I never forget the first time I went to the United Kingdom. I think I was sitting on stage with, Foreign Minister Rob at the time, if I remember right. And I was just launching on Huawei, not very diplomatically, to be honest. And, the room was completely quiet. It was silent, like, oh, what the? It is clearly just some American goofball. The truth is, in the course of 18 months, we gave power and space to the United Kingdom's own security apparatus. They knew we were right about this, and we ultimately were able to convince a significant part of the Western world that they ought to move in the right direction. We didn't change it overnight. We didn't even change it all overnight here inside the United States. But I'll add this last comment. The Huawei storyline was one that Keith Crock and I chose, Undersecretary for Economic Affairs, Keith Crock and I chose very intentionally. We chose Huawei because you could touch it and you could feel it and you could see the metal stamp, and we could demonstrate, albeit not always publicly, but we could demonstrate to anybody who wanted to take a serious look at it that the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese MSS, their intelligence services, were stealing you blind through this technology. So we had a rock solid case. We attempted to use that to make the broader case, which is Chinese technology is inherently in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party, and there is no such thing as a Chinese private company. Once you accept those premises, anytime you're doing business with a Chinese company, that you are in fact dealing with the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party. Once you accept those premises, we felt like we could build out a set of ideas and principles that could protect the West from this predation. And, there was still a long way to go. By the time we left, we did not get all the way to the finish line there by any stretch of the imagination. But the Huawei narrative was one we chose intentionally to provide the basis, the foundation from which to begin to build out what we thought was an important change in the way the world's economy, particularly when it came to technology, stared at the risk associated with Chinese stuff.
Yeah. One of the things that comes up in this context and in the conversation of Huawei and the like is this overall this larger dependence that we find ourselves in on foreign supply chains, primarily China, but not exclusively. Does our government have a good sense of how economically dependent we are on these foreign supply chains, including on friendly nations? One of our guests asks, and do we need to place a greater emphasis on collecting and analyzing economic intelligence when it comes to competing effectively with China?
The second question is clearly yes. We made some strides while I was a CI director, but boy, there's a long way to go in getting this economic intelligence piece right. There's always a little gunch, a little gun shy. It's not how we roll, right? We don't use our intelligence services to benefit our commercial players inside the United States. It's not what we do, and that's right and proper and appropriate. So when you start down this path, you have to make clear, here's our objective, here's why we're doing it, here's what we're actually trying to achieve. But there's a long way to go. And with respect to what we understand, what we can see in the supply chains, it was fascinating as we began to unpack some of America's biggest companies and their supply chains. How when you really pressed through how much there was that was still in some doubt about the origination of some of the components of their products. They thought they knew, they were signing Sarbanes-Oxley statements about where their stuff came from. But in the end, it's a pretty slippery world out there. And to the extent these are small things easily transshipped across the world, the origination of some of this equipment is really, really difficult for a private industry to always track. We should try to help them understand how these supply chains are built out. And then there's a whole bunch of ways one can simply create blanket rules with waivers that provide you a lot more security around supply chains for the things that really matter. Forget trinkets and carpets and simple things that really have no dual use possibilities, let alone primary military tools. If you began looking at supply chains through that prism, you could pretty quickly slice down what you really needed to do, gain the depth you needed, and then begin to push through a set of rules that provided the security levels that were appropriate for the particular technology or the particular component.
Yeah. You mentioned it earlier, and Secretary Blinken had a big speech on China today. One of our guests from Voice of America asks, what do you think about Blinken's China speech today? And how do you assess the appropriateness of his prescription for our policy towards China, towards the CCP in particular? What would it take to do it? And are we really prepared to push forward on that?
So I've read it only once. I'll look at it again this evening. But when I took my first pass at it, it felt like something that Secretary Kerry or Secretary Clinton, or even Secretary Rice or Secretary Powell would have said about China. This isn't partisan. It sounded like diplomatic gobbledygook that said, "Well, we'll work with you when we can, and we want to fix this because." Democracy and freedom. The truth of the matter is we want to fix this to protect the American way of life. The Chinese Communist Party is intent on undermining who it is we are as a people. And so whether it's their Chinese military or the Chinese cyber capabilities or their economic predation, this isn't about preserving the international order. This is about preserving our Judeo-Christian traditions here in America. And I think the remarks that it looked like this had been put together by a committee, and Secretary Blinken was sent out there to go read the darn thing. It took them a year to roll the thing out, and it didn't feel like it had a core thesis of the Chinese Communist Party as evil and capable and intentional about undermining our way of life here at home. And if you don't accept that premise, if you begin from a different place, that this is about the international order and making sure the UN has perfect colored napkins, Xi Jinping will see that and he will view that as a green light. So I hope I'm wrong. When I go reread it, I hope I see some seriousness in protecting and preserving America in a way that I know that it needs to be protected and preserved.
Yeah. Well, we share that philosophy here at NSI. We're not writing papers that are asking whether China is a foe or an ally. We're very clear about a paper Andy Kaiser, who wrote, was entitled countering a hostile foreign threat, Huawei and ZTE. We're not pulling our punches either, and you're exactly right. One of our guests asked about the threat from China and whether we ought to create an Indo-Pacific version of NATO, and if so, Is that different than these economic alliances that we've seen? Is there a military version of the Quad that has a collective defense arrangement? What would that look like? What are the implications of that? And do you think that's the right approach?
So there does need to be a collective defense organization for sure. Call it what one wants to do, right? There were efforts at what was called SEATO a while back. I don't know what shape it ultimately takes, but it can't be an America alone military operation there. It should be deeply coordinated. Some of this is taking place already. Some of it under the umbrella of the Quad. I think that's all to the good, but some of it's happening bilaterally and then others joining in. That's joint training, that's joint information sharing, it's joint systems, procurement so that we're operating from compatible systems. We should focus heavily on making sure that we get those coordinated efforts, those joint efforts between nations locked in important ways. It means that many nations are going to have to pull a little bit more of their own weight. For those nations, they're going to say, yep, and I want to make sure there's an American ship sailing right alongside me, or I'm not about to take on this behemoth of the Chinese Communist Party alone. Think of smaller countries like Singapore and Vietnam and the like. They're going to want to have confidence that the United States is serious about participating alongside of them. And then there may come a moment when something that is more formal, something that looks and feels a bit more like NATO. Look, we already have Article 5 like guarantees with the Philippines and with Japan. So it is not unimaginable that we might expand that reach, but it is important. It is important that you get the structure of this right. We're not ready for this moment yet. We, the Americans, aren't ready for this moment yet because we don't have the structure and the system in place to actually put together an organization that looked like that same thing. War's different today. When we put together NATO, we were thinking about big tank battles. I was a young lieutenant who patrolled the then East German border in 1986 to 1989. The world is a different place today. It's cyber, it's space, it's the Arctic. It's lots of places that a traditional model like NATO may well not fully grasp the breadth of the undertaking that has to take place, that has to be delivered to deter the Chinese Communist Party in the South China Sea and against its littoral and land-based neighbors. I think they fight with them all. They killed dozens of Indians in the Himalayas at 24,000 feet. This is a nation that doesn't respect sovereignty. It doesn't respect human life, but has enormous capability and power, and a leader today intent on first regional and then ultimately global hegemony.
Yeah. You know, one of our guests, Gioma Onwuluzo, asks about one of these new domains of warfare, the cyber domain. He's interested to know, could you clarify for us what you mean by offensive cyber capabilities, what they would look like practically, not getting into any classified information, obviously. Is there a time frame on which we should be sort of thinking about how we might utilize offensive cyber, particularly as we start to think about the larger conflict with China? And what about cooperation between us and our allies on this? Is this an area of potential friction with our allies if we start to get more forward-leaning in the cyber domain, or are they looking for that kind of activity?
Yeah, I don't want to say a whole lot here. When you think of offense, sometimes the difference between a counter strike and an offensive strike is in the eye of the beholder.
Right.
And offense and defense in the cyber world can get pretty messy pretty fast. But suffice to say, when we think of offense, we think of going after a target that is both sending a message and denying the enemy some capability. So you can imagine you had a cyber strike that came from a set of servers at a particular location, and you took down those servers. Yeah, it's a counter strike. Or you could go after those servers and the ones right next to it, and the ones upstream or downstream from that communications node. So there's lots of different pieces to how one might think about this. I was always of the mind that it was designed. You wanted a set of capabilities that could message deterrence, and cyber has the unique good fortune of being able to done in a way that is largely not publicly attributable, done properly. Doesn't mean the bad guy doesn't know. Sometimes you'll want to make sure and send a message so that the bad guy absolutely knows where it came from. Right. But nobody else would, or nobody else could at least publicly demonstrate that it came from a particular place. These are the ideas that underpin how we do offensive cyber. always aimed at the singular objective of either denying them a capability to do harm to us, or second, sending a deterrence model message to them saying, we have this capability, we can take down X, Y, and Z. And if you do something against us, this is the response that will be delivered to you. And this gets to your point on process too. One of the things that we knew that if you were going to actually set out, call them red lines, you were going to set out some boundaries. When somebody violated the boundary, you could not hold a National Security Council meeting. When they violated the boundary, you had to deliver. If it was still up for debate, I promise you, Politico will know. And once Politico knows, the whole world knows that you weren't serious about defending that. And I can give you half a dozen cases where the Trump administration had this piece right, where we had it teed up, we had the response teed up, we had a series of matrix responses prepared to be delivered against a series of threats that had been approved at the appropriate levels. That if the bad guys did something, we knew precisely what we had the authority, the tools we had, and the authorities we had to go respond to them. Didn't have to have a meeting, didn't have to have a debate, no memos written. The memos were done, the debate had been had. We were prepared to actually respond in a real-time fashion that would unmistakably evince our willingness to defend the things that mattered most to America.
Well, Mr. Secretary, I couldn't agree more. And, we're coming towards the end of our time together. And I have one question that actually came from two people in our audience. And so I've got to ask it. You probably knew this was coming. You're looking great. You're looking well. People want to know, are they going to have an opportunity outside of the state of Kansas to vote for a Mike Pompeo sometime in the near future, whether that's in 2 years or 4 years or 6 years from now? Is there another public office run for Secretary Mike Pompeo?
Yeah, maybe I'll run for city council here in my local district, and they can vote for me here.
There you go.
I can't answer the question because it's unknowable at this point. I'm doing the things one would do to get ready for such a thing. I've been in Iowa a lot, New Hampshire. Those aren't secret, not random. We're trying to build out the way that one would build out, so that Susan and I can make what is ultimately a deeply personal decision about whether to pursue the presidency in a year or a year and a half from now. So we'll keep praying, we'll keep working, and probably a year from now or so, we'll have to make that momentous decision. And if we do, we'll do it like we've done everything else in our lives. Jamil, we'll go at it with all the energy we have, with America on our hearts, and then we'll see what the good people of Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina have to say.
Well, Mr. Secretary, I cannot tell you how appreciative I am that you take the time with us to chat with us. Thank you to our audience for being with us today. Just a couple of notes. Join us at the National Security Symposium with the Federal Society on Thursday, June 23rd from 9:30 a.m. to 3 p.m. at Jones Day in downtown DC. We'll have a keynote address, a panel on crypto, a number of other panel on AI. We're also hosting an event with the House Manufacturing Caucus on supply chain disruption on June 28th. Keep an eye on our website for that. And always, check out our podcast, NSI Fault Lines and Iron Butterfly, talking about the experience of women in the intelligence community. Thank you all for being here. We're also having a great summer series on fault lines on human rights. Secretary Pompeo, it's an honor to be with you today. Thank you to Andy Kaiser for helping to make this happen. Secretary, audience, have a great afternoon, great evening. See y'all soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.